Good evening. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. Welcome to this 51st episode of Cocktails with a Curator. Because this evening we will be traveling between the United States and France, I am drinking a quintessential American-French cocktail, which is called a Boulevardier. It was invented in the 1920s by an American writer, by Erskine Gwynn, who founded, between the 1920s and early 1930s, a magazine in Paris called the Boulevardier. And this drink was created in honor of that magazine. The Boulevardier is made out of equal parts of bourbon, sweet vermouth, and Campari. Cheers. We start our journey this evening in the Enamels room at 1 East 70th Street. This was a space that was created in the 19-teens for Henry Clay Frick to display his collection of French Renaissance furniture and Limoges enamels. He had a great collection of enamels, which was mostly acquired from JP Morgan. And you see it here displayed in these vitrines with the furniture and a few paintings around them. Later, the room was dramatically transformed when Frick's daughter, Helen Clay Frick, started acquiring early Italian paintings, gold grounds. And so here you see the room with the Piero della Francesca, Duccio, and Paolo Veneziano, still with one of the two vitrines with a selection of the enamels in it. Of course, this is something that we are working on for the future to try and reinstate the enamels room in many ways as Frick intended it. But while we are at Frick Madison, we have experimented with a modernist enamels room in Breuer's building. So when you come and visit us at Frick Madison on the 3rd floor, you will encounter this room, which displays a great piece of French Renaissance furniture, this dressoir that you see in the middle. Two of the three vitrines you see on the right with enamels, and to the left, this small vitrine with three extraordinary objects. These are the three pieces of Saint-Porchaire Ware, Saint-Porchaire pottery that we own at the Frick Collection, which, as we will see, arrived in the museum at different points. And it is a collection that has dramatically grown in the last 6 years. We are very interested in these objects at the moment, and there is a research project underway on these with the idea of a future exhibition. And these are fascinating because they're so mysterious still in a number of different ways. We don't know exactly who made them. We don't know exactly where they were made. They were produced in the 16th century, probably between the 1540s and the 1560s in France. And there are only about between 60 and 70 of these objects, all unique in shape and decoration, around the world surviving today. These are in museums, both in the United States and in Europe, and also some in private collections. You can see here how the shapes of these objects are based on pretty much on metalwork in some ways. But of course, the relationship between these objects and their decoration and bookbinding, architecture, painted decoration, engravings, and a number of other arts have been drawn in the past by scholars studying them. The central object is the one that was acquired by Henry Clay Frick. Saint-Porchaire Ware was particularly beloved by collectors in the 19th and early 20th century. A number of members of the Rothschild family owned some of these Saint-Porchaire Ware objects, but also, for example, Sir Richard Wallace and other collectors like, of course, JP Morgan, and Frick was obviously very inspired by them. This is a small ewer. Of course, these objects were purely created for decorative purposes. They were not practical objects. They were not used, as far as we know. But you see the very intricate decoration all over this object. These were made with a particularly white type of clay, which, of course, was meant to imitate, in some ways, porcelain, which at this point in Europe was not available, if not from Asia. And what is extraordinary about these objects is that all that you see here, these brown and black and reddish lines, which one would assume are painted on the clay before the object is fired, is glazed and fired, are in fact inlaid. So the white clay was pressed in with stamps, and then in the incised lines, different colored clay, usually brown, black, or red, was inserted to create these extraordinary decorations. And then on top of that, three-dimensional reliefs, here you see sort of little lizards and this heart shape decoration, were applied, colored, and then glazed and fired. This is an extraordinarily complicated technique. It's a technique that we still don't fully understand, but is what makes Saint-Porchaire Ware so extraordinary. These objects were created during the reigns of Henry II of France and his queen, Catherine de' Medici. Henry II died after a terrible accident during a tournament in 1559, and Catherine de' Medici remained as regent and Queen Mother until her own death in 1589. She presided over the courts of three of her sons, of their sons, who became subsequently one after the other kings of France. Those, of course, are Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, until then eventually Henry IV of Navarre became king of France, marrying one of the couple's daughter. This was a complicated and difficult reign, especially under Catherine de' Medici, very much shaped by the wars of religion, the wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, the Huguenots, which of course culminated in one of the bloodiest events of the Renaissance in France, which is the Day of Saint Bartholomew in August of 1572, when the Huguenots in Paris were massacred by the Catholics during a whole day, and of course the violence then spread throughout France. It has been estimated that the victims of the events around the Day of St. Bartholomew were between a few thousand, 3,000, to potentially up to 50,000. And of course, this represented one of the great moments of the struggle between the Catholics and the Protestants in France. The objects we're going to be examining this evening, of course, are very much part of this world, of this very bloody and complex moment in the history of France. Saint-Porchaire Ware is renowned for its extraordinary shapes, and here I'm showing you two examples of two other ewers. The one on the left is at the Louvre, the one on the right is at the museum in Cleveland. And here you see how these forms include human figures and animals and shells and a number of different natural elements, but of course always with this extraordinary colored decoration all over the object, creating different shapes across it. And of course, this is very much part of the decoration that has Italian models all the way back to the Italian Renaissance and the grotesque and a number of sort of decorative elements, which were then brought to France by Italian artists working at the courts of Francis I and Henry II, the so-called School of Fontainebleau, and the decoration of Mannerist objects in France around that time. This is a simpler piece of Saint-Porchaire, a tazza with a lid at the Metropolitan Museum. And this is one of the most extraordinary pieces of Saint-Porchaire, also at the Metropolitan Museum, where you see this very rigorous geometric decoration, but again with these shapes, with dragons and various creatures. And the front, the side of the object that you see on the right, actually has a decoration with the Virgin and Child. Why is it called Saint-Porchaire? And of course, for a very long time in the 19th century, these objects were known as Henry II pottery. It was associated with the reign of Henry II, and that's how it was referred to. Until in the 1890s, French scholars identified mentions in the 16th century to what was then referred to as terre de Saint-Porchaire, Saint-Porchaire earth, or the façon de Saint-Porchaire, the manner of Saint-Porchaire, referring to ceramics produced at the time. And of course, we have no direct link in the 16th century between these objects and the objects that survive today, none of which really has a provenance that goes back beyond much of the 19th century. But since then, since the late 19th century, all of these objects have been called Saint-Porchaire Ware. Saint-Porchaire is a town in the southwest of France, north of Bordeaux. And here you see an image of the center of this town. And it's a town that is known because it has very pure white clay, rich in kaolin, that exist in the area. Of course, what we don't know if these objects were created in Saint-Porchaire itself and then brought to Paris and other important cities in France, or if they were actually created in Paris with materials coming from Saint-Porchaire. The objects were all created for the royal family or aristocrats at the time. They were clearly luxury objects, even though they were made with fairly simple materials. But of course, the technique was what was absolutely extraordinary. What we also don't know if these objects were created by an individual or a single workshop, or if they were created by a number of different workshops, 2 or more, that were active again, either in Saint-Porchaire itself or in Paris, or even possibly somewhere else in France. Considering that there are between 60 and 70 of these objects in the entire world, having 3 at the Frick collection is pretty extraordinary. As I mentioned, only one, the central one, was acquired by Frick. The other 2 are more recent acquisitions. This extraordinary ewer with this half-human figure with this lizard and a number of other decorative elements like mermaids and various other creatures was acquired by the Frick collection in 2015. And it was a gift of one of our trustees, Sydney Knafel. And this went to match the Frick ewer. And only recently, last year in 2020, thanks to the bequest of Alexis Gregory, we've added this third object. This is what is known in French as a biberon. Again, it's a type of ewer with this sort of very narrow spout. And so between 2015 and 2020, we've managed to add significantly to our group of Saint-Porchaire objects. A few years ago, in 2017, we traveled as a group, the curatorial department and our director, Ian Wardropper, to France. And of course, Ian is a great expert in Renaissance French objects, decorative arts, enamels. He has written a book about the enamels at the Frick. And here I am with Amy and with our former curator of decorative arts, Charlotte Vignon, who has been very interested in Saint-Porchaire and spearheaded a scientific project and an exhibition project to work on this group of objects at the Frick. And here we are visiting the Chateau of Écouen, which has a number of objects that relate very closely to Saint-Porchaire Ware. One of the big question marks of the scholarship in recent times has been the relationship between Saint-Porchaire and the work of one of the most famous ceramic artists in France in the Renaissance. And that, of course, is Bernard Palissy, who you see here in a later sculpture celebrating him at the Louvre. He's one of the great sort of figures of decorative arts in France in the Renaissance. He actually came from a Huguenot background, and he was caught in the middle of the wars of religion. Obviously, at that point, he suffered greatly because of being on the wrong side, on the Huguenot side. And there are many stories and many legends about the life of Palissy. But what we do know is that he died in 1589, the same year as Catherine de' Medici, in the Bastille. He was arrested and a prisoner in the Bastille, and he was maltreated there and died in prison. He is famous for a series of ceramics, and here I'm showing you absolutely marvelous and bizarre ewer, which is at the Louvre, because he decorated his dishes and ewers and objects with casts, often taken from life, of shells and small animals, small insects and frogs and reptiles and fish and different creatures that he took molds from live animals and then created these extraordinary objects. So one of the big questions has been, was Palissy involved in any way with the production at Saint-Porchaire? One of the great creations by Palissy was a grotto decorated, entirely covered with these natural decorations, with shells and animals, which he made for the Queen, for Catherine de' Medici, in the Tuileries Palace, what we now know as the Louvre. And this grotto was destroyed, doesn't survive anymore. But in the 19th century, and then again in the 1980s, some excavations revealed pieces of this grotto. And here you see some of them in storage at Écouen. So these are blocks, parts of what was used to decorate the grotto at the Louvre. But what was also found in the 1980s was probably the site of the workshop of Palissy at the Tuileries. And as part of this, a number of molds were found. And these molds were used to create the decoration, the patterns on Palissy ceramics, Palissy ware. One of these objects is particularly important for us. And what you see here is this mold now divided in two parts for a lizard. Of course, this is a fantastic creature. This is not a real lizard cast from life. But what was noticed by Charlotte at the Frick and by our conservator, Joe Godler, who studied this object first, and then we all returned to Écouen to look at these objects in 2017, is that this is the mold that was used to create the lizard on the ewer that was given to us by Sid Knafel in 2015. So this is actually an object, this ewer, which directly links the Saint-Porchaire Ware to Bernard Palissy. Now, how these two were linked is still a big question mark. Does this mean that our object at the Frick was created by Palissy in the style of Saint-Porchaire? So did Palissy work on some of these Saint-Porchaire objects? Was this part of his early career, something that he did as a young man? Or did he inherit some of the molds that were used by the people who made Saint-Porchaire ware, and then they were reused in objects like this, which are somewhat Saint-Porchaire-like in technique and design, but were maybe made by Palissy? Or did Palissy simply inherit these molds eventually, and this ewer was made by someone else, and then for a number of reasons that we still can't explain, Palissy came into possession of the mold? These are all questions that still very much remain to be answered. Charlotte started a research project in collaboration with a number of people in France, and this is still ongoing. And this is just to show how small decorative art objects like these, in fact, are fascinating and very interesting objects in terms of research. So I hope we will have more answers in the future about Saint-Porchaire ware objects. I hope you will all enjoy them when you come and see them at Frick Madison. And I very much hope that we will be able to present a major exhibition in the future on Saint-Porchaire, showing whatever will be uncovered by this research currently happening between France and the United States. A lot of research on Saint-Porchaire was spearheaded in the 1990s by the National Gallery in Washington and by Écouen. And so we're very much building on that research and re-examining many of the findings of that time, trying to draw some new conclusions. And of course, so much of what happens in a museum is about the study and research of the objects. And that is still one of the key purposes of a museum. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about Saint-Porchaire, and I hope you're all enjoying your Boulevardier, and I very much look forward to seeing you next week for another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. Thank you.